Good morning. Welcome to the Wilson Center. I'm Jane Harmon, the president and CEO, and we're delighted that you're here for a very significant event with our National Security Advisor. Let me recognize a few folks in the front row. Our former board member, Carlos Gutierrez, former U.S. Commerce Secretary, and big fan of the president's Cuba policy. He evolved, and I'm delighted that he did. And then some of Wilson Center's finest, Cindy Arnson, who directs our Latin America program, her deputy, Eric, and the director of our, Eric Olson, and the director of our Africa program, Monde Miangwa, and Andrew Seeley, who's the executive vice president of the Wilson Center, and the former director of our Mexico program. We also know, there are no ambassadors. If there are any ambassadors here, my apologies if I haven't recognized you.
Ambassador of Luxembourg is here.
Ambassador of Luxembourg is here. Glad I asked that. Thank you. My trusted buddy, Susan, would point that out. So, a long time ago, I served on a D.C. board. I've been trying to remember which one, with Lois Rice, an enormously capable academic leader who served as vice president of the College Entrance Examination Board and led the development and passage of the Pell Grant program, among other amazing things. Who knew that Lois's daughter would be a rock star in the national security space? Over the years, Susan's and my lives have overlapped in various policy fora and on the tennis court. I encountered Susan early in the Clinton administration when she worked on Africa at the NSC. She has been recognized for her impressive service as U.S. ambassador to the UN and now sits at the crux of security and foreign policy in the Obama White House as National Security Advisor. It honors the Wilson Center that she is here today to talk about new presidential action on Cuba, a country that I've personally visited twice, a fascinating country. It will be more fascinating, I hope, in years forward as it opens up. At any rate, while the Cuban government continues to embrace an ideology that restrains change, the opportunities for the country and its talented people are obvious. President Obama was right. If a policy in place for 50 years doesn't work, we ought to change it. And he did. Much credit for the change in Cuba policy goes to someone who, we have to do this, Susan, you'll love this, who learned everything he knows working at the Wilson Center for Lee Hamilton, who was my predecessor here. That person is Ben Rhodes, Susan's deputy, who was one of the two people who conducted the secret talks that led to normalization of U.S.-Cuba relations. Ben has been back with us several times, most recently to address the board of the Latin America program. And today, we welcome his boss, Ambassador Susan Rice, to learn more about next steps. Susan will speak for approximately 20 minutes, then take a few questions from me, and then take a few questions from you. She has a hard stop in about 45 minutes, I think. Please welcome Lois Rice's daughter and our dear friend, Ambassador Susan Rice.
My mom's going to be thrilled. Thank you very, very much, Jane. Good morning, everyone. I want to thank you for that very kind and very personal introduction. But more, I want to thank you for your extraordinary leadership of this very important institution. I'm really glad to be back here, and I'm grateful for this opportunity to talk about our Cuba policy at a place where so much good work on the Americas has been going on. I also want to recognize and thank former Secretary of Commerce, Carlos Gutierrez, for being here and for his lifetime of remarkable work and achievements that reflect the story of so many Cuban Americans. I've been looking very much forward to coming back, Jane, to the Wilson Center, and you've been very kind to offer this opportunity on a number of occasions. But to do so and to be able to talk about the administration's approach to Cuba and where we see normalization heading is a particularly valuable opportunity. In many ways, it's still incredible to be talking about normalization at all. Some will recall that 54 years ago today, marked the beginning of perhaps the most dangerous moment in human history. On October 14th, 1962, an American U-2 plane flying high over Cuba photographed the construction of offensive nuclear missile sites on the island, missiles capable of striking Washington, D.C., and major cities throughout the hemisphere. For 13 terrifying days, humanity teetered on the brink of nuclear war. McGeorge Bundy, my predecessor as National Security Advisor, called the prospect reciprocal mortal peril. Fortunately, cool heads and vigorous diplomacy averted the immediate crisis, but mutual suspicion remained, and U.S.-Cuba relations remained deeply hostile. For over half a century, the United States tried to isolate and pressure Cuba, cutting off travel and trade and limiting opportunities for Cubans and Americans to interact. The Castros remained in power, while over time the United States found itself increasingly isolated on this issue, especially in our own hemisphere. Even as we reestablished relations with communist nations like China and Vietnam, our posture towards Cuba persisted, driven more by inertia and political calculation than a clear assessment of our national interest. This policy may have made sense during the Cold War. It was rooted in good intentions, but put simply, it wasn't working. Recognizing this reality, President Obama came into office determined to re-examine our approach to Cuba. To begin, we relaxed restrictions on remittances and allowed Cuban Americans to travel home to visit their families. We stepped up dialogue with the Cuban American community. Eventually, we reached out, cautiously and deliberately, to the Cuban government. It took almost 2 years of closely held negotiations, as Jane said, led by my friend and colleague Ben Rose, hosted by Canada, and then by the Vatican. But finally, on December 17th, 2014, the people of the United States and Cuba saw something that many never expected to see in their lifetimes. President Obama and President Castro announced that the United States and Cuba would begin normalizing relations. It will be, I expect, one of the enduring achievements of the Obama administration. Now, I know not everyone agrees with this decision. There are those who believe that normalization is a mistake, or that we didn't extract sufficient concessions. Some reject any notion that the embargo should be lifted at this time, or maybe ever. But the hard truth is that the embargo failed to achieve its stated purpose of overturning the Castro regime while harming the Cuban people. As one 76-year-old Cuban woman wrote to President Obama, the over half-century cruel embargo on this lovely, enduring, and resilient little island just didn't work. If we want to actually help the Cuban people, then it's time to turn the page on a policy that was holding them back. We should learn from over 50 years of experience. Even as we continue to call on the Cuban government to make their own reforms, let's lead by example and make our own. Congress should do its part. We must lift the embargo once and for all. In March, I had the privilege of joining President Obama as he became the first sitting American president to visit Cuba in nearly 90 years. I've been on a lot of foreign trips, but this one was rather special. In addition to President Obama's meetings with President Castro, we met with entrepreneurs and civil society activists. And we capped it off by watching the Tampa Bay Rays defeat the Cuban national team in an exhibition game. President Obama entered the stadium to thunderous applause. I sat near President Obama and the Obama family, President Castro, Jackie Robinson's widow, Rachel Robinson, and Derek Jeter, as a Cuban choir sang our national anthem. It was surreal, to say the least. As I looked at the young people in that stadium and on the streets that greeted our motorcade, it reaffirmed something that the president strongly believes. And that is, we cannot simply stand back and wait for Cuba to change. We should be engaged with the government and people of Cuba right now. In recent years, Cuba has taken some initial steps to reform its economy and open up to the world. And even as we continue to have serious differences, our new policy continues the work that we've begun to build a bilateral relationship, to improve the livelihoods of the Cuban people, to connect Cuba to the United States and the wider world, and to address our differences through dialogue. Today, I'm pleased to announce that President Obama is issuing a new Presidential Policy Directive that will institutionalize this progress and guide the United States policy towards Cuba for the future. This directive outlines the future we'd like to see, a future of greater engagement, greater cooperation, and greater opportunity for Americans and Cubans. It assesses the current strategic landscape and our key policy objectives within that context. And it directs a wide range of agencies, from the Department of Treasury to the Department of Health and Human Services, to expand their engagement with Cuban counterparts to achieve those objectives. Perhaps most importantly, this directive is being made public. In decades past, the United States used to have secret plans for Cuba. Now our policy is fully out in the open and online for everyone to read. What you see is what you get. This unclassified directive supersedes and replaces the previous administration's Cuba policy and any prior classified documents laying out that policy. As President Obama told the people of Cuba in Havana, this is a new day. Es un nuevo día between our two countries. And with the remainder of my time this morning, I'd like to discuss what exactly has changed about our approach to Cuba and why it's so important that we continue on this path. First and foremost, it's a new day for our bilateral relations. After years of bad blood, the American flag flies proudly over our reopened embassy in Havana. Last month, President Obama nominated an outstanding Foreign Service officer, Ambassador Jeffrey De Laurentiis, to be the first U.S. ambassador to Cuba in more than 50 years. Jeff has skillfully represented our interests in Cuba, including as chief of mission in Havana since August of 2014. The best way to advocate for our values and interests is to have a strong ambassador who can travel the country and engage with the Cuban people. Stronger diplomatic ties will enable fruitful dialogue on areas where we differ. So to our friends in Congress who expressed concern about Cuba's human rights record, don't just say you care. Empower our embassy to do its job. Confirm Ambassador Jeff De Laurentiis as soon as you return from recess. Across the board, we're stepping up our engagement between our governments. We've created a new bilateral commission to collaborate on key issues. 6 U.S. cabinet secretaries have visited the island, and 4 Cuban ministers have come to the United States. These high-level meetings have yielded progress on everything from marine sanctuaries to agriculture to biomedical research. As two nations intimately impacted by climate change, we also look forward to partnering to address this grave threat to our planet. We're enhancing our security cooperation. A year and a half ago, an outdated approach listed Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism. Today, it's an emerging partner in the fight against terrorism. Our intelligence and law enforcement agencies have begun to deepen cooperation as well on combating drug trafficking and transnational crime. In January, U.S. Southcom invited a Cuban delegation to its annual Caribbean conference to discuss disaster response and other security issues. As General John Kelly, our former Southcom commander, put it, we've normalized now, and regardless of how we think of each other in terms of politics, we have very, very common challenges. And with viruses like Zika threatening global health security, our health professionals are increasingly cooperating to combat disease, as well as leading new research into cancer control and treatment. It's a new day for our economic engagement as we aim to promote prosperity and opportunity for all of our people. Even with the embargo still in place, the Obama administration has initiated a series of regulatory changes designed to increase travel, commerce, and the free flow of information to, from, and within Cuba. We've authorized the use of the dollar in certain international financial transactions. We've made it easier for Americans to visit Cuba, easier to use American credit and debit cards on the island, easier to sell and to export certain goods and services. American travel to the island has increased over 75% from 2014 to 2015. We've seen American businesses entering Cuba, from General Electric to Airbnb. These changes are fueling Cuba's nascent private sector. The young people at the entrepreneurship event that President Obama attended in Cuba would have felt right at home in Silicon Valley. There was a young graphic designer who's now getting training from the Columbia Business School. There was a woman who created a mobile guide to Cuba, similar to Yelp. One barber commented that a year ago, he was the only cuentapropistas on his street. This year, he estimates there are at least 97 entrepreneurs, that is. More than 1 in 4 Cubans now work in the private sector, roughly double the percentage when President Obama came into office. And we want to keep encouraging that creativity and innovation, just as we've supported openings for American tech companies like Google and Cisco in Cuba. We want to do still more to engage and do business with Cuba. That's why today, the Departments of Treasury and Commerce are announcing further regulatory changes. We're expanding the grants and scholarships that can be made to Cubans to include scientific research and religious activities. That's in addition to the previously authorized grants for humanitarian projects that benefit the Cuban people, such as educational and philanthropic projects. This change will allow the American people to support more Cuban students, academics, and community leaders. We're enhancing medical cooperation, authorizing joint research so that Cubans and Americans can combine their talents in pursuit of vaccines and other medical innovations, and allowing Americans to import FDA-approved Cuban-origin pharmaceuticals that can provide relief to people here at home. And we're lifting the cap on Cuban merchandise that Americans can bring back with them for personal use. That includes alcohol and tobacco products. I thought that may wake some of you all up. You can now celebrate with Cuban rum and Cuban cigars. Despite these changes, there are still firm limits on what can be done without Congress lifting the embargo. So again, I want to reiterate that Congress should listen to the majority of Americans who oppose the embargo, including a majority of Cuban Americans in the Miami community. We need to end this outdated burden on the Cuban people, end the restriction on Americans who want to do business with them, help us secure a better future for both countries through the exchange of resources, goods, and ideas. And if you want to start somewhere, get rid of the travel ban, a policy that almost nobody in America outside of Congress still supports. In that spirit, we also want to encourage the Cuban government to accelerate its pursuit of economic reforms. It should be much easier to start a business in Cuba. One country, two currencies should be phased out. Every Cuban should be able to share in his country's growth, especially members of marginalized communities like Afro-Cubans. The internet should be a tool for the many, not a privilege for the few. The Cuban government has recently established 100 Wi-Fi hotspots around the island, but internet penetration is still only about 5%, one of the lowest rates in the world. That's going to hold back a young Cuban from creating the next great mobile app, or a student from accessing a world of knowledge. So we will continue to urge the Cuban government to do more to connect Cubans to this tremendous engine of growth and to facilitate the free exchange of information and ideas that are the lifeblood of modern economies. While much work remains to be done, it's also a new day in our commitment to promote respect for human rights and universal values in Cuba. Now, I want to be clear. The United States respects Cuba's sovereignty and its right to self-determination. President Obama has also been adamant that the United States has no intention of imposing regime change on Cuba. Cuba's future is for the people of Cuba to decide. But that does not mean that we will sideline our most cherished principles, just as we speak up for these things around the world. We firmly believe that every citizen should be able to choose his or her leaders freely and fairly. We believe in the right of a lady in white to walk through the streets and protest, just as Americans are free to speak out against bias in our criminal justice system. Freedom of speech and assembly, freedom of religion. These aren't just American values, they're universal values. As we do in countries around the world, we will continue to advocate in Cuba for the basic human rights that are recognized by virtually every nation in our hemisphere, and to stand by Cubans who peacefully demand these rights. President Obama has repeatedly raised these issues with President Castro. And President Castro isn't shy to criticize what he sees as flaws in the United States' political and economic systems. In fact, today, our Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy and Human Rights, Tom Malinowski, is in Cuba right now. So when dissidents are jailed or harassed, we will continue to speak out forcefully and demand justice. And we will continue to raise concerns about the intensifying pressure on civil society. But we don't have to conceal our support for our values. We believe that engaging openly and honestly is the best way to advance our ideals. And that's why we're making our democracy programs more transparent, and we're broadening the scope of the civil society that we engage. It's a new day as well for regional and international cooperation. We sometimes forget, but when President Obama took office, the United States' standing in Latin America had suffered. Hugo Chavez and other anti-American voices were ascendant, and our outdated Cuba policy was a big reason why. Time after time and meeting after meeting, leaders from Mexico to Uruguay criticized our approach to Cuba. It was a constant drumbeat, a perennial irritant as we sought greater cooperation with our neighbors. Thanks in part to our normalization policy and an approach to the region based on cooperation and shared values, relationships between the United States and countries across the hemisphere are as good now as they've ever been. While we continue to have serious differences with and concerns about countries such as Venezuela, virtually every country in the region has supported our normalization effort with Cuba. And recognizing that we'll continue to be on different sides of some regional and global issues, We're working to integrate Cuba into the regional and international organizations to strengthen its adherence to the rules-based international order. Already we're seeing what the United States and Cuba can accomplish when we put aside the past and work to build a brighter future. In West Africa, American and Cuban doctors joined together to defeat the scourge of Ebola, just as they've collaborated to care for patients in Haiti. In Colombia, the United States and Cuba continue working to end the longest-running civil war in the Western Hemisphere. Obviously, we're disappointed by the results of the Colombian referendum. The vote was a reminder that there's still work to be done to realize the future for which President Santos and so many Colombians are striving. Last week, President Obama called President Santos to congratulate him on his well-deserved receipt of the Nobel Peace Prize. We're encouraged that the ceasefire continues to hold, that political figures across the spectrum continue to seek common ground, and that negotiators continue to meet in Havana to try to salvage the peace agreement. And we also welcome the announcement of peace talks between the Colombian government and the ELN. Finally, it's a new day for the peoples of our two countries as we work to renew and strengthen the bonds between Cubans and Americans. Cuban Americans have immeasurably enriched the United States, as any baseball fan would tell you. But the Cuban American story is a painful one as well. For too many decades, families were cut off from one another. As President Obama said in Havana, the reconciliation of the Cuban people, the children and grandchildren of the revolution, and the children and grandchildren of exile, that is fundamental to Cuba's future. In the coming months, those children and grandchildren will be able to travel on up to 110 daily round-trip flights from the United States to Cuba. They can send direct mail for the first time in more than 50 years. American cruise liners are docking in Cuban ports. We're encouraging that reconciliation when American chefs like Jose Andres meet their Cuban counterparts, when Shaquille O'Neal plays basketball with young Cubans, or when the American men's soccer team enjoys a friendly exhibition game with Cuba, as they did just a week ago. Next month, Misty Copeland of the American Ballet Theater will travel to Cuba to teach dance classes and clinics. So we're going to continue building bridges between our peoples. We're supporting Cuba's extraordinary commitment to education by expanding education and cultural exchanges, including through our 100,000 Strong in the Americas initiative. This week, 8 Cubans arrived in the United States as part of the inaugural class of 250 young leaders of the Americas Initiative Fellows, who are making our hemisphere more interconnected, prosperous, and secure. That's in addition to the 10 Cuban entrepreneurs who joined President Obama at this year's Global Entrepreneurship Summit in Silicon Valley. As one Cuban American woman says, and I quote, "This is not merely symbolic. As a young Cuban American, I have witnessed the real possibilities that have opened through goodwill to improve relations between our countries and to improve the lives of Cuban citizens." Ultimately, that is what normalization is all about, improving lives. Indeed, as we've traveled around the world, we've heard over and over again that the opening between the United States and Cuba has been a source of hope to people who no longer have any direct connection to this policy. And that's because it sends a message that countries can, in fact, leave behind a history of animosity, because it shows that people do not have to be defined by their differences, because it sets an example for how peaceful engagement can replace perpetual conflict. Later today, like most days, I'll be in the Situation Room, the same place where President Kennedy and his executive committee held their breath for those tense days in October. In fact, we now call part of the Situation Room the John F. Kennedy Conference Room. Who would have thought in those days that we could concern ourselves not with Cuban missile silos and quarantines, but with American engagement on the island? Who would have thought an American president could meet with Cuban entrepreneurs and hear our national anthem in Revolution Square, or that a Cuban president would answer questions from the American press corps? Who would have thought that we could one day overcome the weight of history to forge a more secure and prosperous region together? As we go forward, I'm reminded of the words of the Cuban-American poet Richard Blanco, words he recited at President Obama's second inauguration when he spoke of, quote, hope, a new constellation, waiting for us to map it, waiting for us to name it together. That's the promise of this transformative approach to our neighbor. This is the world Cubans and Americans can shape together. And if we continue on this path, I'm confident that our future with Cuba and in our hemisphere can be bright. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you very much, Ambassador Rice. While you were speaking, I couldn't help but look at Carlos Gutierrez, himself a Cuban immigrant who came to the U.S. as a young person, as I remember this, and then headed one of the major corporations in America and then became United States Secretary of Commerce. So for those who think immigration doesn't matter, just look. Exhibit A. I also want to recognize Ambassador Tony Wayne. I saw him in the corner. We did have another ambassador here. Maybe we have more, who was the U.S. ambassador to Argentina, played a significant role in Afghanistan, and then was U.S. ambassador to Mexico, and now helps us at the Wilson Center as we look at developments in the North American space. And finally, on your comment about the internet, I would just point out that I'm told that the Wilson Center website is not available in Cuba. It's time to open up the internet, folks. I had some questions, but the audience questions are better, so I'm just going to go to them in the interests of time. Question one, what prevents a future president from voiding President Obama's policies on Cuba, tearing them up?
I would argue the answer to that is common sense. We have seen in the short span of time, Jane, since December of 2014, just how much traction this policy change has gained and how much support it has among the American people. It was a failed policy that we decided to replace. It had manifestly not achieved its objectives. And while we have no illusions that change in Cuba will come overnight or be linear or swift necessarily, we're wholly convinced that through economic engagement, people-to-people ties, dialogue and advocacy for our values, we will have greater success over the next 50 years than we've had over the past 50. We have human relationships that will be very difficult to break. We have business relationships that won't be in our interest to break. It would be profoundly unwise and counterproductive to turn back the clock. And I'm confident that, that the sheer logic and wisdom of this change will endure.
And isn't it also true that the younger generation, especially in Florida, doesn't see these issues the way their parents and grandparents did?
I think that's very true.
So that's question one. Question two, what has been the response of the Cuban government, both positive and negative, to the opening up of Cuba that has been driven by the Obama administration?
Well, it's been largely positive. President Castro has obviously himself made the decision to pursue this change, not without reaction from some of his closest relatives, and not without some reluctance in some quarters. And as I said, this transformation in our relationship is not going to be linear. I'm sure we will, on both sides, experience occasional setbacks. But it's an extraordinary amount of change that has occurred in what is not even 2 years to date. And when you look back at where we were this time in 2014, it would have been inconceivable to think that we are where we are today. And so I think that across the spectrum, as I tried to outline in my remarks, the depth of our ties is growing, the breadth of our ties, government to government and people to people, is also growing. And from the United States point of view, I think, as I've argued, it's manifestly in our interests. I think in Cuba there are some who will fear this change, and who may continue to resist it. But I think the weight of opinion and the opportunities that are in front of the Cuban people are such that on the Cuban side as well, it will be very unwise to change course.
Well, you mentioned human rights in your talk. Would that be a significant area of pushback if you had to pick one?
It's a significant area of difference, no question, and will remain so. But when the president was down in Cuba, I joined him in a very frank and very worthwhile discussion with Cuban civil society activists, some of whom have been mistreated before and after that engagement. But the fact that Tom Malinowski, our Assistant Secretary for Democracy and Human Rights, is down there engaging in the human rights dialogue that was committed to by the two leaders when we were there in March is a sign that we are making some progress. And I'm sure that dialogue will be scratchy in parts, but that's the point. We don't have to agree on everything to have relationships with one another. Any more than we have to agree on everything with other countries with whom we have complex relationships.
Well, I agree. And when I was there on my first trip as a member of Congress on a trip sponsored by the Center for Democracy in the Americas, I don't know if there she is, Sarah Stevens is here. We had opportunity to discuss this in depth. They had some issues with us too. And some members of our delegation met with Alan Gross, who was subsequently released. So it is an ongoing dialogue, and I think it's very important that it stay actively at the top of the agenda. Finally, this question is interesting. Why is the administration pursuing incremental regulatory change? It is slowing down, this is the allegation, the business community's ability to be as aggressive as many want to be. The administration may have more wiggle room. Why not do it all at once? Thought you'd like that.
Well, first of all, is those who are steeped in this know, there is an extraordinarily complex and multi-layered set of constraints on U.S. economic engagement with Cuba. I mean, we've had 50 years of law and regulations layered on top of each other, and it's a very complex nexus to begin to disentangle. We are trying to do this as best we can, consistent with the law, and we have worked to try to bring opening and change as swiftly as we can. Had we waited to try to do it all at once, it probably would have been delayed. I think our interest was in starting down this path and seeing progress proceed, even if not to the maximum extent at the outset. But I'm confident that the changes, including those regulatory changes that were announced today, will further expand our ability to trade, to engage, to research together, to do things that are in our mutual interest. And while what is absolutely necessary for us to go the full distance is for the embargo to be repealed, we are doing what we can within the constraints of the law to change this approach.
Well, we have a few minutes left, so let me just close with two questions. One is on the embargo. I know you have suggested that Congress lift it, and you've suggested that our ambassador be confirmed. How do you handicap the chances of that getting done in the lame duck session?
The embargo or the ambassador?
Either.
The embargo, I'm not
holding
my breath for.
Ambassador.
The ambassador I hope for. I realize the lame duck is going to be a very short session with many things on the plate. But we think it would be very wise for Congress to take this step. Ambassador De Laurentiis has been previously confirmed by Congress. He is a career Foreign Service officer of the highest caliber. He's an apolitical appointee. And he is down there now doing the business of the United States. And by having him confirmed as ambassador will strengthen and enhance his ability to do the job he's already doing. So I know nothing in Washington anymore should be called a no-brainer, but this comes as close as I can think of.
Yeah, well, we were all for more brains in Washington, and we have many of them at the Wilson Center.
Amen.
And we watched painfully as it took so long to confirm our current ambassador to Mexico, a good friend of the Wilson Center and a very capable woman. So hopefully this too will happen. Final question, legacy. President Obama seems to be going to the places on his bucket list, which are, again, places that showcase issues he cares about. He's been making many moves about national parks and so forth domestically, but he also has an international agenda, and obviously this is part of it. Where does Cuba fit in the Obama legacy?
Well, I think if I were wise, I wouldn't try to forecast the legacy with any certainty while we're still in office. I think that will be for scholars at the Wilson Center to research and analyze. But let me say this from where I sit in the heat of things. The opening to Cuba was something that President Obama long thought would make sense, that our 50 years of failed policy ought to change, that we didn't want to reaffirm that the definition of stupid is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So that was our hope. The primary impediment, or the proximate impediment, was, of course, the detention of Alan Gross, which was a horrific and unjustified, painful legacy of the past. And he suffered enormously, and job one was to resolve that. In the context, however, of working to resolve that, we saw the opportunity to do more and to change in more fundamental ways what had been a relationship that was not productive and wasn't serving our interests. It was, in fact, hardly a relationship. And so we decided that given this opportunity not only to see Alan Gross come back home to his family, but also to change in profound ways 50 years of failed policy was something that we ought to do, and do to the extent we could at once. And that was the decision that we made, and that was the approach that we tried to drive. And I think that it is transformed in many respects the way the United States is viewed in Latin America more broadly. It's created openings and opportunities for improved relationships, even with countries that we had good ties to, but we had this sort of weight around us and hanging from each of those relationships and our larger relationship with the region. So I think this will, in all likelihood, as I said in my remarks, be something that when we look back with the benefit of hindsight will have been a wise choice and a bold choice, and one that I hope we will continue to be very proud of.
Well, I'm guessing that most people in this audience, physically here and those in overflow rooms and listening in as we live stream this, sadly not in Cuba yet, are applauding the change and recognize that U.S. leadership, even when it might have been late to this party, matters. And I want to salute you personally, Susan, for your leadership. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me, Jane. Appreciate it.
Ladies and gentlemen, your attention, please. We ask that you please remain in your seats until Ambassador Rice is able to exit the auditorium. Please stay in your seats. We thank you for your cooperation.